I have told this account 3 times before the Archive Commission, and once before the conclave of remaining voices, and each time I was asked whether the numbers in the record were accurate. Each time I confirmed them. I will confirm them here as well. Whoever reads this after I am gone: 7 transports, 1 hospital ship, 1 cordon frigate running escort, and enough medical personnel to treat every living Veldrath survivor twice over, which, at the time of the convoy's arrival, amounted to 9,214 souls aboard 3 failing ships in the dark of the Akan corridor. We had asked for nothing. We had not known there was anyone to ask. I should explain what I mean by that, because the conclave has since framed the event as a distress call answered, a technical transaction, a relay-flagged emergency routing through the standard humanitarian channels, and that framing, while administratively tidy, is not true. What I sent into the Akan corridor on the 43rd day of our drift was not a formal distress signal. It was not addressed to any authority. It was not formatted to any conclave specification. It was a harmonic. A speaker-caste harmonic? The kind we once sang into the deep fracture beds of Veldrath Prime, when the stone itself was cracking and we needed the resonance to hold. I sang it because I had nothing else left to do, and because the frequency felt, in some way I cannot fully articulate to a non-speaker, like the right shape for what we were, lost, held together by a structure that was failing, waiting for something to hold us back. I had no expectation that it would reach anyone. I should explain the shearing as well, because not everyone who reads this will have lived through it or understood it from the transmissions that eventually reached the wider conclave. The shearing was not a weapon. It was not an attack in any conventional sense. It was a resonance cascade, a catastrophic harmonic inversion in the deep core of Veldrath Prime, the kind of event that our Singer engineers had theorized for centuries, but always believed would be preceded by measurable precursor harmonics, giving us time to evacuate, to reinforce, to counteract. There were no precursors. The deep lattice inverted without warning, and in approximately 9 minutes, the structural resonance that had held the planet's silicate crust in stable formation for 11,000 years reversed phase. I will not describe what happened to the people who were still planetside. I have done that in other records, and I will not do it again here. What I will say is this: we lost 640,000 Veldrath in those 9 minutes. Nearly the entirety of our civilization's active population. The transit ships that survived were the ones already in the corridor, 3 academic and freight vessels, none of them designed for mass population accommodation, all of them now carrying 3 to 4 times their rated passenger load, because we had tracked onto them every person we could reach in the hours before the cascade completed. The Veldrath Orbital Authority's emergency relay had broadcast a distress flag for 11 days before its power cell failed. In those 11 days, no one answered. Not the conclave, not the Hethval Compact, whose relay station sat 12 light days from the Akan mouth, not the Drev Assembly, whom we had treaty obligations going back 6 generations. The silence was not malicious. I have since learned that the relay's flag was received by 3 different conclave member species and logged as a potential geological event requiring assessment before response. Assessment. They were assessing while we were dying. The assessment period was still ongoing on the 43rd day of our drift when I opened the speakers channel on the 3rd transit ship, the Velakon's cradle, pressed my resonator palms to the hull's conductive lattice, and sang, "My name is Sorith Velakon. I was the senior Speaker-Caste Archivist for the Veldrath Academy of Deep Resonance. I am the last living person to hold that title. I am one of 11 Speaker-Caste Veldrath still alive in the galaxy. What I know about harmonics and what I know about silence are the same thing, because they have always been defined against each other. The harmonic is only meaningful because of the silence it breaks, and the silence is only bearable because somewhere, eventually, there will be a harmonic. I sang into the Akan corridor because I was a speaker, and that was what speakers did. I did not know there was a human listening post, 3 light days from the corridor's outer boundary. I did not know that humans had listening posts at all. At that point in my understanding of the galaxy, humans were a footnote in a comparative xenobiology survey I had read approximately 20 years prior. This is what I want the record to hold. I was not calling for them specifically. I was not calling for anyone specifically. I was singing because my people were still alive. And I was the one whose function it was to make the shape of that truth audible. They answered in 11 hours. Before I describe the answer, I want to say something about the 43 days that preceded it. This is an account that the Commission and the Conclave have found least useful for their formal records, because the formal records are interested in the event, the rescue, the convoy, the logistics, and not in the interior landscape of the 43 days leading up to it. But I am an archivist, and the archivist's function is to hold the true shape of things, and the true shape of what happened to us includes those 43 days. First week after the shearing, we were still in a state of operational emergency. There was no time for anything except survival, rationing the food stores, reconfiguring the atmospheric processors, establishing sleep rotation schedules, triaging the injured, beginning the catastrophically inadequate process of documenting who was aboard each ship and who was not. That process was the worst of the first week. To walk through the cradle's crowded corridors with a recording tablet and a list of names and begin matching faces to entries. And beside each name not matched, the word for which we have many, gone, lost, absent, unaccounted, was an exercise in controlled, unbearable counting that I conducted for 6 days straight because I was the senior archivist and there was no one else to do it. At the end of 6 days I had a full manifest, 9,214 names, 640,000 blanks. The second and third weeks were worse than the first in some ways, because the operational emergency had created a structure to exist inside of. And when that structure's most acute phase passed, there was nothing left between us and the fact of what had happened. The Veldrath are not a species given to public displays of grief. Our social structure roots grief through the Speaker-Caste harmonics, which are sung collectively in a very specific cadence during the resonance rites, and without a proper resonance rite, with 11 speakers spread across 3 ships and no planetary lattice to sing into, we had no proper vessel for what we were carrying. I held 2 makeshift resonance sessions in the cradle's cargo hold, using the acoustic therapy generator to approximate the planetary lattice frequency. They were inadequate. They were also the best anyone could do, and the people who attended them came away, if not restored, then at least briefly audible to each other in the way that matters. Acknowledged, held in the same shared frequency, not alone. The children were already beginning to show resonance lag signs by the end of the second week. The exoskeletal lattice in Veldrath juveniles requires continuous exposure to the subharmonic frequencies generated by an active planetary core during the critical formation years, and our generators, designed for transit use, rated for a maximum of 18 days of continuous operation, were beginning to cycle unevenly. The 2 acoustic healing practitioners we had aboard were doing what they could, rotating the generator output to maximize the developmental frequency coverage. They were 2 people managing the needs of several hundred children, and the math was not in our favor. I noted the children's status in my daily condition log along with everything else. The power cell depletion rates, the food stock calculations, water reclamation efficiency, the medical inventory. I had been trained as an archivist to notice what was true and record it accurately. What was true was that the children were in trouble, and we did not have the resources to fix it, and so I recorded that. I did not editorialize. The record was the record. By the 4th week, the Veldrath Orbital Authority's relay had been silent for 13 days. I had attempted to reach the Hethval relay station directly, using the cradle's long-range transmitter, and had received no response. I had attempted to reach the Drev Assembly's nearest diplomatic outpost, and received an automated acknowledgement that my message had been logged and would be reviewed by the appropriate committee. I had attempted to reach the Conclave's Humanitarian Coordination Bureau directly, working from the contact frequencies as listed in the Veldrath Academy's Interstellar Communication Register, and received a message informing me that non-emergency contact with the Bureau should be routed through the standard member species diplomatic channels. I noted these outcomes in the condition log, non-emergency, 43 days adrift with failing power cells, 200 children in developmental suspension, and 640,000 dead. Non-emergency. The assessment period was still ongoing. I will say this for the record, because I want to be accurate and fair, and because the archivist in me will not allow the simplification. I do not believe the conclave member species who logged our distress as pending assessment were evil. I believe they were bureaucratic. I believe they were operating within systems designed for the ordinary pace of interstellar coordination, which moves slowly for good structural reasons, and that our situation did not register to those systems as the kind of crisis that warranted the disruption of ordinary procedure. I believe that the people who received our flag genuinely intended to respond in time, by which they meant challenging in the time available given their standard operational tempo, which did not account for the fact that our standard operational tempo was measured in days of survival remaining. I am able to understand this now. On the 43rd day, I was not in a state to be charitable about it. I was in the cargo hold of the cradle at approximately the 3rd hour of the morning watch, in the dark, because I had stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a stretch, and because the cargo hold was the only space on a ship carrying 4 times its crab sims rated population where I could be reliably alone. I had my resonator palms on the deck plates. The deck plates were cold and they held no harmonic. They were freight-grade alloy, not speaker's lattice, but I had my palms on them anyway. I sang the archivist's harmonic, the one we use when we need to record something true that has no official format. It is a long, slow note, and it goes into the stone, or in this case, into the deck plates, and it holds there for as long as the medium can sustain it. I sang into the Akon corridor, because the corridor was what we had, and because the medium of my voice was what I had, and because 9,214 people were still alive, and I was the one whose function it was to make the shape of that truth audible. I did not know it would reach anyone. The first communication came through on a standard conclave registered emergency frequency. 11 hours later, surprised me, because I had not transmitted on any conclave registered frequency. The translation was rough. Human common rendered into Veldrith harmonic notations by a system that was clearly not designed for speaker-caste frequencies, so the message arrived as a kind of blunt-as-edge chord rather than the clean tonal line I would have preferred. But the meaning was clear enough. They had received an anomalous resonance signal from the Akon corridor. They were attempting to identify the source species. They were asking for a condition report. I gave them one. I told them our ship count, survivor count, our power cell status, our medical situation, which was severe, because we had no trauma physicians of any kind aboard the cradle. Only 2 acoustic healing practitioners, whose methods were effective for minor lattice fractures but inadequate for the injuries a resonance cascade left behind. I told them that we had been drifting for 43 days. I told them that the Veldroth Orbital Authority's relay had been silent for 32 days. I told them that we had received no response from any conclave member species. I did not ask for help. I realize, in retrospect, that this may have seemed strange. But I had grown accustomed, across those 43 days, to the idea that help was not available, and there seemed little point in requesting what could not be provided. I stated our situation. I asked them to log it in whatever record system they maintained, so that if we did not survive, someone would eventually know where we had been. The response came back in 4 hours. Rough translation again, the same blunt chord rendering, but I had begun to adjust my ear to it. They were not going to log it. They were coming. I did not understand this at first. I transmitted back asking for clarification. What were they sending and in what capacity? A conclave observer? A survey vessel? A diplomatic courier, perhaps, authorized to formally register our distress with the member bodies on our behalf? Their answer was not a diplomatic courier. I have since learned, through extensive conversation with humanitarian logistics officers, what they sent was a standard resource class mass evacuation package, which is the designation given to a response convoy intended to fully evacuate and medically stabilize a population in acute survival crisis. I have also learned that the standard resource class mass evacuation package is not, by any definition, a small undertaking. The humans, apparently, do not do small when small is insufficient. They do what the situation requires, and then they add a margin, because the margin is what allows for the unexpected. What the situation required by their assessment: 7 LST-9 heavy evacuation transports, each rated for 1,800 passengers in emergency configuration. 1 Callaway-class hospital ship, the ESV Mended Shore, carrying a full surgical suite, 3 intensive care decks, 240 medical personnel, and enough pharmaceutical and equipment stocks to run a mid-sized planetary hospital for 6 months. 1 Sentinel-class cordon frigate, ESV Hardline, running escort and communications relay, 9,214 survivors, 12,600 beds available on the transports alone. The math was not subtle. I learned all of this gradually, in the 11 days it took them to reach us. We communicated every 6 hours. The translation system improved with each exchange. One of their communications officers had begun running the Veldrath harmonic notation through a secondary processor that smoothed the tonal rendering considerably, so that by day 8 of the waiting period, I was receiving messages that felt not quite like speaking to another speaker, but like speaking to someone who was making a genuine effort to learn the shapes of our language rather than just flattening them into something legible. Her name, I eventually understood, was Specialist Yale Drummond. She was 26 years old by human reckoning, which I gathered was quite young. She worked the night communications rotation on the ESV Mended Shore, which was the hospital ship, and she had apparently volunteered to take the frequency as an additional assignment because the harmonic difference fell inside the sonic parameters she used for a personal acoustic instrument hobby she pursued in her off hours. I did not fully understand this at the time. I understand it better now. She told me, over the course of our communications, about the convoy's composition. She told me what each transport was carrying: food stocks, atmospheric processors calibrated for silicate biology respiratory needs, resonance dampening rest chambers for Veldrath passengers. They had designed these specifically for us, based on the physiology notes in the Conclave Xenobiology Registry, in the 11 days of travel, and a full inventory of the acoustic healing equipment our own practitioners used, which they had apparently sourced through 3 separate supply chains across 2 different Conclave member species, because the standard human medical inventory did not include it. I asked her how they had obtained our practitioner equipment specifications so quickly. She said the logistics officer had pulled the Academy of Deep Resonance's published equipment catalog from the Conclave Open Archive and simply ordered everything on it. I sat with that for a long time. On the 44th day of our drift, the day after I had sung into the corridor, I had made a calculation that I have never shared publicly because it seemed at the time like the kind of thought that should not be stated aloud. The calculation was simple. At our current rate of power cell depletion, 3 ships and 9,000 mouths, and the heating requirements for Veldrath physiology in a drift environment, we had approximately 60 to 70 days of meaningful survival time remaining. After that, the cells would begin failing. The ships would go cold. We were not equipped to transfer ourselves to another environment because we had no other environment. The Akan corridor was where we were, and the galaxy had logged our distress as pending assessment, and I was the last Speaker-Caste Archivist, and I had 11 of my caste left, and 640,000 of my people were gone. I had not been sleeping. None of us had been sleeping well. The children in particular, the young ones in their pre-lattice stage, before the exoskeletal matrix fully sets, were suffering in the drift environment, because the resonance conditions that support healthy lattice formation in Veldrath juveniles are very specifically tied to the sonic frequencies of an active planetary core. We had brought resonance generators aboard. The generators were rated for short-duration transit, not for 43 days of continuous operation, and several of them had begun to fail. 212 Veldrath children were in what our healers call resonance lag, a developmental suspension that is reversible if corrected in time and permanent if it is not. I had not told the Conclave about the children because the Conclave had not asked, and because there was no point in reporting a situation to an audience that was still assessing. I told Specialist Drummond on day 9 of the waiting period. I told her in the same flat tonal line in which I had been giving condition reports, because that was how I had trained myself to speak about our situation. Factually, without affect, because affect was not useful, and also because I was not entirely certain, by that point, that I had any affect left to give. 212 children. Resonance lag. Reversible if corrected soon. Here is the specific frequency range required for correction. Here is the specific generator output specification. The response came back in 40 minutes, rather than the usual 6-hour interval. She had woken the Mended Shore's chief medical officer, a Dr. Farouk Osi Mensah, who had then spent approximately 30 minutes on the communications terminal, asking me very precise technical questions about Veldrath juvenile lattice formation, questions that suggested he had read everything in the conclave registry about our physiology and was now filling in the gaps that the registry did not cover. He had already spoken to the engineering team about the resonance generators. He had already calculated whether the hospital ship's own harmonic therapy suite could be reconfigured to the correct juvenile frequency range. He had already requisitioned additional generator hardware from the convoy's supply stores and was having Arnett pre-staged for transfer the moment they arrived. 40 minutes. The conclave had been assessing for 32 days. I should be precise about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters, and because the official record does not capture it. I did not feel relief. I felt something I do not have a Veldrath word for, a sensation of the framework I had built around myself, the careful structural thing I had assembled out of flat tonal condition reports and practical calculations, and the studied removal of hope, developing the first crack it had developed in 44 days. That crack was very small. I was not yet willing to trust it. I had learned, across those 44 days, that the universe was not obligated to hold, and I was not willing to lean my full weight on one communication from a species I barely knew until they were actually in front of me, and it was actually happening. But the crack was there. The Mended Shore appeared at the Akan corridor's outer boundary on day 54 of our drift, and I was in the cradle's observation chamber when the proximity sensors picked up the convoy's approach signature. Our sensors were degraded by then. The corridor's debris field had taken out 2 of our long-range arrays, but close range was still functional, and I watched the contact signatures resolve on the display panel one by one, because they were coming in from a bearing that brought them into range sequentially rather than all at once. The Mended Shore first, a large vessel, larger than I had expected. I had formed in my mind an image of a hospital ship that was roughly hospital-sized, the scale of our own medical stations, which are modestly built and practically appointed. The Mended Shore was not modest. It was, I later learned, one of the largest active vessels in Earth's humanitarian fleet, nearly half a kilometer along its primary hull, the silhouette shaped by the external docking arrays and the extended sensor fins and the heavy ventral hinge-trawl housing for the surgical suite. It put out, even through the degraded sensors, a signature that read as organized and purposeful and, in some frequency I recognized from my speaker training, without being able to fully name genuinely calm, not the calm of nothing happening, the calm of something that knows exactly what it is doing. Behind it, the 7 transports, not in tight convoy formation but spread slightly, which I later learned was standard Earth humanitarian practice, a broad approach formation that maximizes sensor coverage of a debris field and allows for rapid deployment of rescue shuttles without congestion. They were large ships, wide-hulled, the kind of hulls that, when you look at them and know they are rated for 1,800 passengers in emergency configuration, make the arithmetic visible without any further explanation. Behind them, the hardline, the cordon frigate, running the rear guard. I counted them. I counted them twice, because I had been told the number, and I still could not make myself believe the number until I had counted with my own sensors. 9 ships. Ships for 9,000 survivors. I have been asked, in the 3 tellings before the commission and the one before the conclave, whether I wept at this point. I will give the same answer here that I have given in those sessions. Not at that moment, no. I was still in the flat tonal mode. I was still running calculations. I was noting the power signatures, the approach vector, the communications channels, opening up one by one as each ship identified itself and its manifest and its medical capacity and its docking. Figuration. I was noting that the mended shore had already begun broadcasting a specific harmonic frequency on the Veldrath acoustic register, the juvenile lattice frequency calibrated exactly right, which meant Dr. C had done the reconfiguration work during transit, and that the children on the 3 ships who were in resonance lag were already beginning to respond. I was noting all of this. I was not weeping. I was working. What I will admit in a record that is intended to be complete is that my hands, the resonator palms that I use to interface with the hull lattice when I sing, were pressed flat against the observation chamber wall, and that I became aware of this without knowing when I had put them there. They were reading the hull. Speakers do this unconsciously when they are listening for something. When I noticed my hands on the wall, I understood that I had been listening for the convoy's harmonic signature, the way you listen for a voice you have not yet fully allowed yourself to. The first shuttle from the mended shore docked with the cradle, 40 minutes after the convoy reached optimal docking range. I was at the airlock when it opened. The team that came through was not what I expected. Prepared myself. I had spent the 54 days of waiting preparing myself for whatever human medical personnel looked like. My 20-year-old xenobiology survey had described as bipedal, bilaterally symmetric, substantially fragile by silicate species standards, soft integument and limited harmonic range. All of that was accurate as far as it went. What the survey prepared me for was the particular quality of competence that walked through the airlock with them. There were 8 of them on the first shuttle. 4 medics, 2 acoustic therapy specialists, 1 structural engineer for the resonance generators, and Dr. O.C. Mensah himself, which I had not expected. I had not expected the chief medical officer of the hospital ship to be on the first shuttle. I had assumed he would coordinate from the mended shore while secondary teams worked the initial assessment. He was not secondary, he was first. He came through the airlock carrying a diagnostic kit and a translation tablet, and a very quiet expression that told me, without any words, that he had read everything available about Veldrath physiology, and that he understood the situation, and that he was not going to waste my time with anything that was not necessary. He introduced himself, he introduced his team, he said, in the flat, information-forward way that I have since come to understand is characteristic of human medical professionals in active deployment. We understand your primary concern is the children in resonance lag. Can you take us to them first? Yes. Could take them to the children first. I walked ahead of them through the cradle's corridors. I had walked those corridors for 54 days and I knew every handhold, every low clearance junction, every place where the overhead lighting had failed, and the auxiliary strips were the only illumination. The humans followed behind me, and I was aware of them behind me in a way that was different from the awareness I had carried for 54 days of being aware of what was behind me, which was always the fact of the shearing and the silence and the failing generators. This was a different awareness. The sound of 8 people who knew what they were doing, moving through a corridor, with purpose and without haste. I will not describe the next 6 hours in full detail because what happened in those 6 hours is the kind of thing that is difficult to describe in a way that preserves its actual character without sounding like something other than what it was, which was medicine. It was just medicine. Expert, methodical, thoroughly prepared medicine. Dr. O.C. Mensah and the acoustic therapy specialists moved through the children's quarters on all 3 ships. They had transferred between vessels twice in those 6 hours, shuttling back and forth, with the recalibrated harmonic generators and the mended shore's broadcast frequency, working in combination, and one by one, the children who had been in resonance lag began to come back into phase. First child to come fully back into resonance was a 4-year-old named Vel Sorath Okan, a Holder caste child, small even for her age, with a lattice matrix that had been showing deep suspension signs for 11 days. I was present when Dr. O.C. Mensah's acoustic therapy specialist ran the recalibrated generator over her exoskeletal frame and brought the frequency up to the correct developmental range. The child's lattice luminescence, which had been dim and irregular for 11 days, steadied and brightened to its proper pale amber glow. The child looked at the human specialist who had done this. A young man with a very still, focused manner of working, and made the small harmonic sound that Veldrath children make when they are comfortable, when the resonance around them is right. The human specialist looked at the child's luminescence with the expression of a person who has just watched something they were hoping would work. 212 children. By the end of those 6 hours, 212 children in stable resonance. The rest of the medical team had dispersed across the 3 ships for the broader casualty assessment which I had provided in advance, but which they verified personally. Not because they distrusted my report, I later learned, but because human medical protocol requires direct assessment regardless of reported data, which strikes me now as a sensible policy. They found 47 cases of serious injury or illness beyond what I had logged, either because or healed them in the chaos of the first weeks, or because conditions had progressed in the intervening time. None of those 47 cases were going to be treated on the transit ships. They were moved to the mended shore within the first 12 hours. The evacuation itself took 4 days. I want to be specific about this because 4 days sounds fast, and I want the record to understand why it fast. It was fast because the 7 transports had been pre-configured for exactly our physiology before departure. The resonance-dampening rest chambers were already installed. The atmospheric processors were already calibrated. The food stocks were already in formats compatible with Veldrath ingestion, which requires a specific particle suspension that is not the default configuration for most galactic food production systems, and which the humans had sourced and prepared in advance. Every transport had a crew member assigned to Veldrath communication liaison, briefed on basic harmonic frequency protocol, with a translation assistant running real-time on their personal communicators. They had thought about us before they arrived. They had thought about us specifically, in detail, and they had prepared for us. And, when we came aboard the transports, we entered spaces that had been arranged for our comfort by people who had never met a Veldrath, but had done the work of learning what Veldrath needed. On the first transport I boarded, I walked the length of the passenger deck ahead of the first group of Veldrath survivors we were transferring, checking the configuration, looking at the rest chambers, the atmospheric processors, the generator arrays set into the deck at the intervals our physiology requires. They had the spacing right. They had the harmonic dampening panels correctly angled to produce the low-frequency resonance envelope that allows Veldrath to sleep in transit environments. Someone, in the 11 days of travel to reach us, had looked at the specific technical requirements for Veldrath sleep hygiene and implemented them correctly. I stood at transport's deck and I tried, very deliberately, not to make a sound. I was not successful. The sound I made was not a word. It was a short tonal burst. Involuntary, the kind of harmonic that escapes before you can contain it. One of the human liaison officers in the corridor behind me asked, with genuine concern, if everything was all right. I told her yes. Everything was as good as it could be. She nodded and went back to her work. I moved between the 3 transit ships during the evacuation, helping coordinate the boarding sequences and answering the many questions that my people had about the humans and their vessels and what was going to happen next. I answered what I could. What I could not answer, the questions about destination, about long-term resettlement, about whether there was any prospect of return to Veldrath Prime, I handed to the human liaison officers, answered with a clarity and a patience that I found frankly impressive, because those are very hard questions to answer clearly and patiently when the answers are largely, we don't know yet, but we will work on it. None of the human liaison officers made the answers sound easy. None of them pretended the road ahead was short. They said plainly that the resettlement process would be long and complicated, and that Earth's diplomatic corps was already engaged with the conclave on the question, permanent housing. They said that the humanitarian station where we were going had facilities for immediate stabilization, and that the next steps would be determined from there. They said these things without false comfort and without procedural coldness, in the direct, unhurried way that told me They were not reading from a script, but simply telling what was true. I had spent 43 days receiving non-answers and no answers and pending assessment answers. The directness was almost disorienting. On the third day of the evacuation, I was crossing between the cradle and the first transport when I was hailed on the command frequency by the Hardlines captain. I had not spoken directly with the captain of the Cordon frigate before this. Most of my contact had been with the Mended Shores staff and the logistics officers on the transport convoy. His name was Commander Alexei Vronsky. His voice through the translation system came through as a very dry, level harmonic. Competent and unhurried, the kind of voice that has said difficult things in difficult situations. Often enough that it no longer needs to perform any particular quality to communicate that it means what it says. He told me that the Hethval Compact had contacted the convoy 6 hours earlier to inform them that the Akan corridor fell within a zone subject to Compact navigational authority, and that the convoy's operations should cease until formal transit authorization was processed. I asked him what that meant. He said it meant they had told him to stop, and he had said no. I asked him whether that was going to create a problem. He said it might create a paperwork problem. He said he didn't particularly care about paperwork problems. He said the Compact's authorization office had an average processing time of 3 to 6 weeks for standard transit requests, which was notably incompatible with the current situation, and that he had therefore logged the convoy's operations under Earth Emergencies, Humanitarian Protocol 7, which allowed unilateral action in active life threat scenarios and did not require advanced Compact authorization. He said, the Compact was welcome to file a formal complaint with the Earth Diplomatic Corps if they felt strongly about it. He said all of this in a tone that suggested the Compact complaint was not something he was losing any significant amount of sleep over. I was quiet for a moment. Then I asked him, had anyone from the Conclave or the Compact contacted them before this during the transit? Anyone attempted to reach out to coordinate or to participate in the response? There was a pause. Not a processing pause, a human pause. The kind that precedes a statement someone is choosing how to phrase carefully. He said, did receive one query from a Conclave assessment office on day 3 of our transit, asking us to confirm that we had received proper species documentation before initiating medical operation. We confirmed it and continued. A query on day 3. Day 3 of their 11-day transit to reach us, which was day 47 of our drift, which was 4 days after I had sung into the corridor and they had answered, which was 16 days after the Hethval relay station, 12 light days away, had received our flag and begun its assessment. I thanked Commander Vronsky. I told him I understood. He said very briefly that there was nothing to thank him for, which I had by then begun to recognize as a characteristic human response to gratitude. Not dismissive, not false modest, genuinely disinterested in the accounting, as if the gratitude were beside the point. On the 4th day, the last of the surviving Veldrath came aboard the transports. The 3 transit ships were left in the corridor. There was nothing to be done with them, and we had no crews to pilot home, and home no longer existed in any form that could receive them. I stood at the observation port of the transport I had been assigned to and watched the cradle's running lights go dark as we drew away. I had spent 57 days on that ship. The hull lattice had held the shape of every harmonic I had sung since the shearing. It would hold them for as long as the hull held together, which in the Akan corridor's debris conditions would perhaps be a generation, perhaps 2. Long enough. The convoy assembled in departure formation. The Mended Shore leading, the 7 transports in the broad spread, the hard line at the rear guard. 9 ships. The transit to the relay point that would connect us to the nearest Conclave humanitarian station would take approximately 20 days, during which the Mended Shore's medical staff would continue treatment. The acoustic therapy specialists would continue working with the resonance lag children, fully recovered now, benefiting from continued support. And Specialist Drummond would continue improving the harmonic translation protocols she had been refining since the first day of contact. In the first days of transit, I found myself repeatedly stopping in the middle of whatever I was doing to simply stand still and register where I was. I was on a ship that was moving toward something, rather than drifting away from it. I was surrounded by 9,000 people who were alive. The children were in stable resonance. The atmospheric processors were running correctly. The food supplies were not being rationed. These facts had a weight I could not process efficiently. I had spent so long carrying their opposite that their presence felt, in some structural sense, unstable, as if I had not yet learned how to hold things that were good, rather than merely not yet catastrophic. There is something specific I want to say about the second day of transit, because it did not make it into any of the formal accounts, and I think it should. I was in the transport's common deck, a wide, low-ceilinged space that the human designers had configured as a communal area, with a series of resonance panels set into the walls at regular intervals, playing a low harmonic background that was close enough to the acoustic environment of a Veldrath public gathering space to feel, if not like home, then at least like a deliberate attempt at the memory of home. Several hundred Veldrath were in that space. Some were sleeping, some were eating, some were simply sitting, very still, in the way that Veldrath sit when the body is present but the mind is somewhere else. In the lattice, in a memory, in the precise location of a person who is no longer locatable anywhere. One of the human liaison officers was sitting with them, not talking, not managing, not doing anything official. Just sitting in the middle of the space in the same, still way they were sitting, as if she had decided that what was needed in that room was simply another presence that was not going anywhere. She did not look at me when I came in. She was looking at the resonance panel on the far wall, her expression quiet and unremarkable. I do not know if she understood what she was doing. I think she may simply have been tired and found the common deck a comfortable place to be tired. But what she was doing, whether she understood it or not, was the speaker's function. Being present in the frequency of the people around her, holding the space open by being in it, not filling the silence but not abandoning it either. I sat down on the other side of the room, and I did not speak to anyone, and we were all together in the quiet for a while, and it was, in its way, the closest thing to a resonance rite I'd had managed since the shearing. I spoke with Specialist Drummond most evenings. She was still on the night communications rotation, and, in the absence of an operational emergency, she was using the channel between us to work on translation protocol. Asking me questions about speaker-caste frequency structures, having me sing specific tonal phrases into the recorder so she could map the harmonic notation with precision. I answered her questions. I sang what she asked. In between we talked, in the imprecise way that is possible when the translation system is still learning, about smaller things. What her instrument hobby involved, what the Academy of Deep Resonance had been like, what Veldrath Prime had sounded like in the deep stone harmonics before the shearing. I had not talked about what Veldrath Prime had sounded like since before the 43 days. There is Speaker-Caste record of the deep stone harmonics, a continuous archive going back 6,000 years, and the full record is in the Academy's archive, which was stored on a distributed server network, off-planet, and survived the shearing. I have access to it. I can listen to it whenever I choose. But listening to it is not the same as describing it to someone who has never heard it, and describing it is not the same as having it. And the having of it is what we lost, and I know that, and I was aware, in those conversations with Specialist Drummond, of the difference between the three. She did not pretend the difference was small. That, too, was something I noted. On the 6th day of transit, I asked to speak with the Mended Shore's commanding officer, not Dr. Osi Mensah, who was the medical authority, but the ship's captain, a woman named Captain Thao Nguyen, whom I had not met in person but had seen briefly during the evacuation, moving through the boarding operation with the same quiet competence that seemed to characterize all of the humans I had encountered. She was a small person by human standards, I had gathered, and she ran a very large ship with a manner that reminded me of senior Speaker-Caste Archivists I had known. People who understood the resonance they were responsible for and who maintained it without needing to announce that they maintaining it. She agreed to speak with me. We used the improved translation protocol that Specialist Drummond had been building, still not clean, still with that blunt-edged quality, but functional. I told her I needed to understand what was owed. She asked me what I meant. I explained. In Veldrath's social structure, all significant acts of provision, all aid, all rescue, all gift-giving above a threshold of meaningful consequence, exist within a framework of reciprocal obligation. This is not a moral framework in the way that I have since learned some other species understand the term. It is a structural one. The universe, in Veldrath understanding, is made of resonances in dynamic balance. When one resonance sustains another, the balance shifts, and the sustaining resonance creates a claim, not a debt in the extractive sense, but a structural truth, a weight in the system. The appropriate response to being sustained is to acknowledge the weight and to seek, over time, to return the balance. What the convoy had done for us was not small. It was not a minor provision. It was the difference between 9,000 lives and no lives, and the difference between 212 children in reversible suspension and 212 children who would carry permanent developmental damage into whatever future they had. This was not a minor resonance. This was the largest single act of provision that the Veldrath, the remaining Veldrath, which was all of us now, had ever received from any party. I needed to know what was owed so that I could carry the knowledge properly, so that my people could carry it properly, so that the system was acknowledged and named and held, even if the return of balance would take generations. Captain Wynne was quiet for long enough that I began to wonder if the translation had failed. Then she said, "Nothing is owed." I told her I did not understand. She said it again, "Nothing. Not the debt is waived. Not we will collect later. Consider it a diplomatic investment. Nothing." The word she used in the translation's rendering came through as a clean, flat tone, a tonal line that had no edge, no hook, no trailing obligation, a tone that simply stopped. I asked her how that was possible, she said, very briefly, as if the explanation were obvious. "Because you needed it and we were able to come." I held that for a very long time. I am still holding it in some sense. I do not have a Veldrath structural framework that accommodates it cleanly. The resonance of what she said does not balance in any way I was trained to recognize. It is not an exchange. It is not an investment. It is not a gift in the sense of a deliberate bestowal that generates reciprocal obligation. It is something else. Something that the universe apparently contains that I had not previously encountered, which is the possibility of help that genuinely does not ask to be repaid. The Veldrath, in 11,000 years of civilization, had never built a word for this. We had words for gifts. We had words for loans. We had words for mercy. Is a gift extended to someone who cannot return the balance, and is offered as a conscious sacrifice of the claim. We had no word for the thing Captain Nguyen had described, because we had never encountered a resonance that did not, in some fundamental way, want to be in balance. I have been working, in the years since the evacuation, with the remaining speakers and the Academy archivists who survived, build that word. We have not settled on one yet. The construction is difficult because the concept is genuinely foreign to our structural understanding of the universe, and when you are trying to name something foreign, you have to be very careful not to accidentally name a version of it that you already have a word for. What I know is that the word, when we find it, will have the same quality that Captain Wynn's answer had. It will be clean and flat, and it will stop completely. No trailing obligation, no hook. Just the statement of a thing that was given, because it could be given, to people who needed it, with no further architecture required. On the 19th day of transit, Specialist Drummond completed the first full harmonic-otation lexicon for human Veldrath translation. Nada. Rough translation system, but a proper one. Map to speaker-caste frequency ranges, capable of carrying tonal nuance, rather than just semantic content. She had been working on it since the first day of contact. She sent it to me as a gift. She used that word, a gift, and she meant it in the plain and uncomplicated way that I was beginning to understand. Humans used it, without any structural framework behind it. Just the thing itself, with a note saying she hoped it would make things easier. Have since sent it every Veldrath speaker-caste, archivist and communication officer working in the refugee settlements. It has been used in every formal exchange between the Veldrath resettlement communities and the human aid personnel assigned to support them, and I have been told by every speaker who has used it that it is accurate and careful. and that the frequency mapping is done with the kind of attention that you give to something you actually care about getting right. She was 26 years old, and she spent the 11-day transit and the 19-day return journey building something precise and useful and good. Because she could and because we needed it. I think about that sometimes. On the morning of the 20th day, the Menzinger proximity sensors picked up the Conclave humanitarian station's beacon, and the convoy began its deceleration approach. The station's communication officer reached out to request a manifest and a formal intake briefing, and Captain Wynn's communications team provided one. I was told later that the intake officer had expressed some surprise at the convoy's size, had asked apparently whether the full complement of 9 ships had been strictly necessary given the survivor count. Captain Quinn's communications officer. I was not present for this exchange. Commander Vronsky told me about it afterward with a quality in his voice that I will describe as dry and extremely level, had replied that the convoy had been sized to the situation and that the situation had been 9,000 survivors who needed to be alive at the end of it. I was in the observation chamber when the humanitarian station came into view. It was not a large station by some standards, a mid-tier conclave facility, broad and utilitarian, with the green and white markings of the humanitarian registry, and a receiving bay that was already extending its docking arms to meet us. My people were beginning to gather at the observation ports on their respective transports. I could see the Veldreth silhouettes against the other ship's viewports, pale amber in the port lighting, the faint lattice luminescence that marks our species, visible even at that distance. 9,214 of them, every one alive. The cradle's hull had held the harmonics I sang into it for 57 days. The harmonic I sang into the Akan corridor on the 43rd day, the one I had not expected anyone to hear, had been held. It turned out, by a human listening post 3 light days from the corridor's boundary, run by 12 people on a rotating watch schedule, who had apparently been told that the listening post's function was to monitor anomalous acoustic signals in that sector of the drift lanes, and who had apparently taken that function seriously enough to spend 11 hours identifying the source, species, locating the contact frequency, and sending a reply. I do not know the names of those 12 people. I have asked, and I have been given several of them, but the full list has not been made available to me through official channels. I would like it to be known in this record that I want those names. Not to acknowledge a debt, there is no debt. Captain Wynn made that clear. But because I am an archivist, and the archivist's function is to hold the true shape of things. The true shape of our survival includes 12 people on a listening post who were paying attention when the galaxy was not. The docking arms connected. The airlocks opened. The Veldreth, 9,214 souls, moved from the human transports to the humanitarian station in an orderly sequence that took most of the afternoon, and the human liaison officers walked with them the entire way, not directing them, not managing them, just walking with them. And when the last Veldreth had passed through the airlock, the station's intake officer made a note in the formal record, and somewhere a tally was updated, and the situation that had been pending assessment for 55 days was officially closed. The convoy departed the following morning. I was at the station's external observation deck when they went. The mended shore first, then the transports, then the hardline at the rear. They left in the same formation they had arrived in, that broad, vertical spread that maximized sensor coverage. And within an hour, they had cleared the station's visual range. Within 6 hours, they were beyond the range of my acoustic receiver. I stayed at the observation deck for a long time after they were gone, long enough that one of the station's staff came to ask if I needed anything. I told them I was fine. I was not fine, exactly, but I was not in distress either. I was in that state that follows the end of a sustained effort. The framework you built to get through the thing has not yet fully released, and you are still standing in the shape it made for you, not quite certain who you are when you are not inside it. The observation deck had a viewport that looked out over the station's docking approach, a long arc of reinforced glass curved to follow the station's outer hull. On the rear side of the viewport, I could see the last of the docking arms retracting, The berths where the human ships had been now empty and dark. The far side of the viewport I could see the stellar field of the approach corridor. And somewhere in it, already too distant to resolve, 9 ships were moving away at transit speed. I had spent 11,000 words of this account explaining what humans sent, and how it arrived, and what it meant, because I am an archivist, and that is what I do. I account for the true shape of things. But I want to be honest about something that is harder to account for than ship counts and generator specifications and formal exchange records. What I felt, standing at that viewport watching the approach corridor close over the place where the convoy had been, was something I have no accurate Veldrath word for. Not grief. Grief is a specific harmonic in our tradition, and I know it intimately, and this was not it. Not gratitude in the conventional sense. Conventional gratitude carries the structural weight of the obligation framework, and Captain Wynne had dismantled the obligation framework with 9 words. Not even relief, exactly, though relief was present. It was something underneath those things. Something that the 43 days of drift had made it impossible to feel, because it requires, as a precondition, the belief that the universe contains things other than what you are currently experiencing. I had stopped believing that, at some point in the 4th week. I had not admitted it to myself at the time because I needed to function, and admitting it would have made functioning harder. But standing at the viewport, I understood that somewhere around day 28 or day 30, I had quietly and privately concluded that the universe was simply and entirely the Akon corridor, the failing cells, the drifting ships, the pending assessments, the silence, and that there was nothing outside it. Not because I thought that was literally true, because I had stopped being able to feel that it wasn't. The convoy had not just brought transports and a hospital ship. It had brought the evidence, in the form of 9 ships that were actually there, and 12,000 beds, and 240 medical personnel, and one 26-year-old acoustic specialist who had learned enough about our language to carry its tonal nuance. That the universe was not, in fact, only the Akon corridor. That there was something outside the silence. That the silence had an edge. That the edge could be crossed. This is what I want the Conclave's formal record to hold, and the Academy's archive to hold, and this document to hold. The fact of the crossing. Not just the logistics of it. The fact that something was on the other side. I pressed my resonator palms to the observation deck's railing. Metal, no harmonic, no lattice. I sang anyway. Not a distress harmonic this time. Not a speaker's signal into a corridor that may or may not have been listening. Something quieter. Something that a speaker sings when they are trying to say, "This happened, and it was true, and it should be known." A harmonic of record. The kind you sing into the deep stone so the stone remembers. The station railing did not resonate. It was not built for resonance. But the acoustic chamber of the observation deck caught it anyway, and held it for the length of the note. And when the note ended, the silence that came back was not the silence of the Akon corridor. Not the silence of the 43 days before I had sung and been answered. It was a different kind of silence. The kind that comes after something has been said and heard and acknowledged. I am still trying to build the word for that too.